Okay, before we get into the specific steps of designing your research, I would like to take a moment to zoom out and have a look at what are the general approaches in research methodology. And one of the most basic distinctions in research methodology is the distinction between qualitative research and quantitative research. So, what is the difference between the two? And there are several differences, and one difference is the type of data that the two use. In qualitative research, the data can be almost anything. It can be text, it can be images, it can be audio, while in quantitative research, the data tends to be numerical, and at the maximum, it has a few labels in there, such as, for example, whether a person received a treatment or whether that person didn't receive a treatment. Another difference is how the data is collected. In qualitative research, the data collection tends to be unstructured, flexible, and sometimes a little bit subjective. Whereas in quantitative research, the data collection tends to be structured, standardized, and relatively objective. So let's have a look at a little example. An example of qualitative research could be an interview or survey with spontaneous, open-ended questions. So there's no clear plan in advance where the interview will go, but the interviewer just follows the flow of the interview and asks questions in whatever way seems to make sense. And those questions also tend to be open-ended, so that there's no predefined answer. An example of quantitative research, on the other hand, could be, again, an interview or survey, but this time with predefined and close-ended questions. So this time the researcher thought about the questions and the order of the questions in advance, and the questions are also close-ended in the sense that there is a set of possible answers, and all the respondent can do is select one of these predefined answers. Another difference between qualitative and quantitative research is the usage, and as a rule of thumb, qualitative research tends to be great and popular in unexplored research topics and topics that are hard to quantify. And the reason for this is that in unexplored research topics, it's often not clear where the research should go and, for example, what questions make the most sense to ask. So in that case, it makes more sense to just go with the flow of the conversation and see where the conversation leads us. A disadvantage of this is, of course, that it can be very subjective, and the results can be heavily influenced by the choices the researcher makes during the data collection. Therefore, as a rule of thumb, in more explored research topics, quantitative research tends to be very popular and widespread because it is great for precision and zooming into details with relatively high objectivity. And because of this, as a rule of thumb, research tends to evolve from more qualitative research towards more quantitative research. As the topic gets more explored, researchers move from qualitative methods to more quantitative methods. So just to illustrate how this works, let's have a look at a little example. Let's say that you do research about an unexplored culture, and the first thing you could do is just go to the people and have a conversation and see what kind of topics pop up. So for example, you could ask a general question such as, would you mind telling me a little bit about your everyday life? And then the person might say something like, I work as a manager and my wife works as a waitress. And maybe after talking to a couple of people, you notice that there seems to be a pattern. It seems to be that men tend to have higher positions compared to women. But so far, this is just an impression. So it would be nice to quantify this. So you could think that maybe I should compare the annual wages of men and women. And then you have moved from a qualitative approach where you ask open-ended questions to a more quantitative approach where you use numerical data to learn something about that culture. Another nice analogy is also when you get an exam at your medical doctor. So in that case, the doctor may first ask a general question such as, how can I help you today? And then you may say something like, I feel weak since a few days. And then based on that, the doctor may think that maybe you have a fever, so let's measure your temperature. And then the doctor has basically moved from a qualitative approach towards a more quantitative approach where he zooms into the details. And that is illustrative of how research often tends to evolve. It often starts with qualitative research and then it moves step by step towards more quantitative research. So the key lessons of this lecture are that qualitative research uses a more unstructured and flexible approach, which tends to work well in unexplored research fields, whereas quantitative research uses a more structured and standardized approach, which works well for zooming in into details with relatively high objectivity. And in well-researched fields, quantitative research tends to be the most common. Not all the time, but as a rule of thumb. And because of that, this course is going to focus heavily on quantitative research. Because most of the time, especially if you're a beginner, you will find yourself in a research field that is already quite well explored, and you're just trying to fill a gap in that research field, which you often do with quantitative research. And so in the remainder of this course, I will walk you through the steps of quantitative research. And I'll see you for that in the next lecture.